How are Latinos portrayed in American films? How has our cultural memory in the United States affected the imagery of Latinos and their culture? And how is this portrayal changing? With these questions in mind, I set out to create a film about how students, faculty, and guest speakers at the University of Richmond think of the changing Latino image in American popular media. But first, some background and history. The Mexican-American War was fought between 1846 and 1848. Support for the war in the United States was based on the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Anglo-Americans had a God-given right to expand their territory across the North American continent. This idea justified the forceful takeover of Mexican lands that included parts of what is now California, Utah, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and Wyoming. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, added 1.2 million square kilometers to the U.S. and served as a culturally important moment. The West was ready for exploration. Although the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo explicitly promised land rights to the Mexican population living in new U.S. territory, the belief of manifest destiny in U.S. settlers won yet again. The new American Southwest was portrayed as a wild, lawless place and was treated as such by settlers. The land rights for Mexican Americans in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo were ignored, and Mexican Americans were portrayed as violent, dangerous, and dishonest.
Latino is a term that defines an identity that is linked to being a descendant from a Latin American country. Having been born here or not is not here in the United States, is not to the point. It's a point of identity with and allegiance with a group that is larger than a traditional hyphenated group, such as Cuban American or Mexican American or what have you, dash American.
I think being a Latino is having a similar mindset, having a lot of focus and emphasis and love for your family, and having like a common view on life.
Latinos have been portrayed, have been represented in U.S. film since the beginning of time, since the beginning of the cinema. We go back to the earliest days of the cinema and we find images of characters that are identified as of Hispanic descent some way or another. We have a very constant presence of Hispanic characters, what then were called Hispanic characters, in U.S. cinema, and as the politics of the relations between the U.S. and other Latin American countries, and then the U.S.'s own reactions to its Latino, to its Hispanic populations, have evolved over the years, so too have those representations. So it's one thing to look at very early cinema where you still have some resentment over border crossing activities and resentments over a border that has moved over a certain part of the population in the West. The border moved. The people didn't move. They didn't cross the border. The border itself moved.
In his book, Latino Images in Film, Charles Ramirez Berg details 6 common Latino stereotypes found in many early American movies. The function of these early stereotypes, which can also be applied to ethnicities outside of the Latino community, is to illustrate the superiority of the typical Anglo hero in relation to faults and differences in other races.
This is a story of one of the most mysterious characters to appear in the early days of the West. He was a fabulous individual, a man whose presence brought fear to the lawless and hope to those who wanted to make this frontier land their home. He was known as the Lone Ranger. Before his coming, this new land of the West was a wild, unruly territory into which brave American pioneers moved in covered wagons, on horseback, and afoot. Theirs was a rugged existence, for they not only had to settle and build, they had to fight. Here, beyond the reach of law and order, might was right. The best shot was the best man.
They're archetypal stereotypes, and I think you could find equivalents to them in the representation of any other culture by any culture. In other words, when a culture attempts to represent others, I think generally those 6 stereotypes will cover the gamut of the strategies that are used to do so. I mean, stereotypes exist, and Ramirez-Berg makes this argument, has always made this argument. They exist because they're based on fact, and they exist as shortcuts to depict realities and truths that are much more complex, but the stereotype serves as a useful shortcut up to a certain point, up to the point where it becomes an insulting shortcut.
I feel like Hispanics and Latinos in American media are portrayed like they can't properly speak English.
Buffalo dying. Horse look bad. May shoot him?
No, Tonto. I'm going to try to pull him through. Well, old fellow, you're in bad shape. A lot of bumps and bruises. Tonto, get some rags from the supplies and bring the canteen.
Me do.
Besides the common stereotype of poor English, several other stereotypes emerge in Hollywood films. Many male characters are portrayed as mysterious, dangerous, and violent, while female characters are often shallow, hot-tempered, and overtly sexual.
For a very long time, senorita, I have waited this pleasure.
When I say no before, you did not believe me, eh? Now I must show you. When I say no, I mean no!
And these kinds of shortcuts are used to represent others in all sorts of contexts. You know, one of the issues that has always intrigued me is not only how Hollywood chooses to represent Latin Americans or Latinos, because sometimes that seems so cut and dry, but it's the flip side is really interesting. How does Latin America represent Americans? And when you look at it, you realize, okay, we have the same stereotype function going on, because otherness, there are only so many ways to represent otherness. That's the opposite of what you are, using some kind of shortcut. It's really a mechanism of trying to establish, trying to mark the otherness, as well as establishing communicability with an audience that's going to be holding some preconceptions about what that other is about. In terms of how these have evolved over time, I would argue that they have evolved significantly over time because they're much less black and white than they once were. I think that when you look at Hollywood film, and also if you broaden the scope, it's not just Hollywood film, but audiovisual production in general, taking into account television, you see a diversification of audience positions and of the representation of Latinos.
I've started to notice more people, more Hispanics and Latinos, being in big movies and shows like Modern Family, for example.
Latinos are the fastest growing minority population in America. And it's, by comparison to other minority populations, we are moving into the realm of the well-educated, right, with access to higher ed. So that is changing the demographics in terms of the rising middle class. So when you have college-educated audiences demanding, and/or, actually this is the most interesting part, now participated in the production of these representations, then you're going to see changes. You know, when Latinos represent themselves, how does that change the use of these stereotypes? Does it at all?
The 2008 movie Sleep Dealer by Peruvian-American director Alex Rivera provides an interesting look into new self-representation of Latinos that is taking place in American cinema. By portraying the Latin American protagonist, a young Mexican man with a penchant for electronics, as a resourceful and, in the end, capable hero, Rivera shows a reversal of the typical hero and villain roles seen in past Hollywood films. The film is set in a dystopian future. The portrayal of Americans as either ignorant or apathetic and allegorical representations of U.S.-Mexico relations leads American audiences through a self-examination of how America's foreign policy towards the border and throughout the world affects characters like Sleep Dealer's hero, Memo. This type of forced self-examination through a film's reversal of the hero-villain dynamic can be seen in several recent films by Latino directors. most notably Robert Rodriguez's Machete, starring Danny Trejo as the morally superior hero battling against a conspiracy between a corrupt U.S. senator, a ruthless Mexican drug lord, and a morally void businessman trying to bring him down. These new Latino-made films centered around the U.S.-Mexico border are important because they point to a growing shift in consciousness and a changing image of Latinos in popular American culture through self-representation. As these films continue to be made and processed by American audiences, they will lead to a changed and more aware cultural memory in the future.